Welcome to Attic Static. Today we have two stories for you, The Passenger of the Third Eye and The Echo of Line 4. Sit down, relax, and enjoy. The Passenger of the Third Eye. I'm sitting at my kitchen table this morning, the sun finally bleeding through the blinds, and I can still feel the phantom weight in my passenger seat. My hands are shaking just a little bit as I hold this mug of coffee. People think being a rideshare driver is all about the scenery and the steady income, but they don't tell you about the final fare feeling, that heavy, anticipatory dread when you know your shift is ending and you're waiting for that one last soul to board. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The city was hushed, draped in that velvet blue silence that only exists in the deepest hours of the night. My dashboard glowed with a soft amber light, casting long shadows across my hands on the wheel. Then, the notification chirped. A single passenger. Pickup location, the Old Orchard Lane. Drop off, the end of the road. When the door opened, I expected a tired office worker or perhaps a student heading home from a late library session. Instead, a woman stepped in. She was dressed in a heavy, charcoal gray wool coat that looked far too warm for the mild evening. Her hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her face was pale, not ghostly white, but a muted, matte gray. "Just to the end of the road," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange resonance, like she was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. As we pulled away from the curb, I noticed something peculiar. She didn't look at the scenery. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like a statue. But as we drove, the atmosphere inside the car began to shift. The air grew heavy, smelling faintly of damp earth and old parchment. It was a thick, suffocating scent that made my lungs feel small. Then she spoke again, her eyes still fixed on the dashboard. "Do not fall asleep," she whispered. I chuckled nervously. "It's just a 10-minute drive, ma'am. I think we can manage." She didn't smile. Her eyelids flickered once. "The road is long for those who dream. If you close your eyes, the distance will stretch. If you sleep, the destination may never arrive." I took her warning with a grain of salt, as drivers often do. But by minute 3, the streetlights began to behave strangely. Instead of passing us by, they seemed to linger. One light would hang in the air for an eternity, illuminating our car before finally vanishing into the darkness. The road began to curve into a labyrinth of twisting paths that didn't seem to lead anywhere specific. I felt my eyelids growing heavy. It was the kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones, the kind where your head feels like it weighs 50 pounds. I fought it, blinking rapidly as we entered a stretch of woods where the trees were gnarled and leafless. That's when I heard the first sound. It wasn't outside the car. It was inside. It was a soft, wet ticking, like a clock made of water droplets hitting stone. Asterisk, drip. Tick. Drip, asterisk. I looked at her. She was still perfectly still, but her head had tilted slightly to the side. Her eyes were wide open now, staring at me with an intensity that felt physical, like she was pinning me against the seat. "The ticking is your heartbeat," she said softly. "But it's also the sound of the road moving behind you." I tried to keep my eyes on the asphalt, but the shadows in the back seat began to stretch. They weren't just shadows, they were reaching. They looked like long, spindly fingers made of ink, creeping out from the corners of the roof and dancing toward the floorboards. My eyelids began to droop again. I fought a yawn, but my head gave a tiny, involuntary nod. For a split second, I drifted. In that microsecond of sleep, the car didn't just move, it rippled. The walls of the car seemed to melt into liquid silk. The sound of the tires on the pavement changed from a hum to a low, mournful moan. I snapped my eyes open with a jolt. The woman was no longer sitting in her seat. She was leaning forward, her face inches from mine. Her hair was flowing around us like it was underwater, though there was no wind. "You drifted," she whispered, and for the first time, I saw her teeth. They were small, sharp, and perfectly square. I tried to stay awake," I stammered, my voice trembling. "The road noticed," she replied. Suddenly, a massive jolt shook the car. The scenery outside went from a blur of gray trees to a blinding, shimmering white. It felt as if we had fallen through a crack in the world and landed on solid ground. I blinked, my vision clearing. The silence was absolute. We were no longer in the woods. We were parked in the middle of a vast, perfectly flat field of white grass under a violet sky. There were no trees, no lights, and no houses. Just the endless expanse. The woman exhaled a long, shimmering breath that turned into mist before it hit my nose. She stood up, her wool coat fluttering even though there was no breeze. "We have arrived," she said. She stepped out of the car, but instead of walking away toward the horizon, she simply dissolved. She didn't fade like a ghost. She broke apart into tiny, glowing particles of light that drifted upward like sparks from a fire. I sat there for a long time, my hands still gripped tight on the steering wheel. The heavy scent of earth had vanished, replaced by the smell of fresh rain. Then, the car door swung open by itself. A gust of cool air rushed in, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. I realized then that the end of the road wasn't just a physical place. It was the point where her world met mine. She had been waiting for someone to stay awake long enough to see it. I took a deep breath and finally let my head rest against the headrest. For the first time in hours, I closed my eyes, and this time, I didn't fall into a dream. I just slept. And now, our next story. The Echo of Line 4. Log entry, Day 1. The Fire Lookout Tower is a lonely sentinel in the heart of the Blackwood Pines. My job is simple: watch the horizon, record the shifts in light, and keep the log. It is peaceful here. The only sounds are the wind through the needles and the occasional crackle of dry brush. I have my radio and my heavy rotary telephone, a relic left by the previous keeper. It has a long cord that snakes down from the catwalk to the observation deck. Log entry, Day 4. The silence started to feel heavy today. To break it, I decided to test the phone line. It's an old copper wire stretching miles into the valley. I dialed my own number just to hear the mechanical click of the dial. I expected a simple hum, but instead, I heard a faint, rhythmic scraping sound on the other end. Like a fingernail dragging across velvet. Log entry, Day 7. The first call happened at 3:14 a.m. I was jolted awake by the shrill ring of the telephone. It was a piercing, metallic cry in the dead of night. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached for the receiver and lifted it to my ear. At first, there was only silence. Then a sound, click, a sharp, deliberate snap of a switch. And then a voice not mine, but not entirely foreign, whispered, "Is it?" I froze. It didn't finish the sentence. I looked out into the dark forest, expecting someone to be standing at the base of the tower. There was only shadow. Log entry, Day 10. The calls are becoming frequent. They happen in patterns now. Every hour on the hour, the phone rings. When I answer, there is a 2-second delay before the sound begins. It isn't a voice anymore. It's a series of wet, rhythmic thumps. Thump, thump, thump. It sounds like something heavy is walking on the outside of the tower, but when I look down from the catwalk, the forest floor is empty. The snow is undisturbed. Log entry, Day 14. The voice returned tonight. It was clearer now. When I picked up the receiver, a dry, papery rasp whispered, "You yet?" I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the caller were finishing the thought from Day 7. The sequence was unfolding. I realized then that these weren't just random calls, they were responses to my own presence in this tower. Log entry, Day 18. The atmosphere is shifting. The wind has stopped, but the telephone hasn't. It rings every 3 minutes now, almost impatiently. Tonight, when I answered, the voice was no longer a whisper. It was a frantic, jagged melody of sounds, the sound of a door creaking, the sound of water dripping, and finally, a clear word, "Near." I gripped the wooden railing so hard my knuckles turned white. Something was moving in the treeline, just beyond the reach of my lantern light. Log entry, Day 21. The calls are becoming intimate. They are no longer happening at set intervals. The phone rings whenever I stop writing. It's as if the tower is waiting for me to pause. I answered it just now. There was no voice. Instead, there was the distinct sound of my own breathing, heavy and slightly jagged, coming from the receiver. But I wasn't breathing hard. The other side was mimicking me in real time. Log entry, Day 24. Panic has set in. Every time the phone rings, the forest feels smaller. The trees seem to lean inward toward the tower as if eavesdropping on our conversation. The voice spoke again at midnight. It was no longer a rasp. It was a perfect imitation of my own voice, trembling with an eerie, hollow resonance behind. I spun around. Nothing was there, but the temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. I could feel a presence standing exactly 3 feet behind me, even though the room felt empty. Log entry, day 26. The calls are now constant. The phone rings so often that it feels like a pulse. It doesn't matter if I'm holding the receiver or not, the sound of something moving on the line is always there. The voice has started to form full sentences. They are fragments of my own thoughts, uttered seconds before I think them. Caller, cold. I felt a shiver. The temperature did indeed drop. Caller, lonely. I looked at the empty chair opposite me. The tower felt crowded with invisible ghosts. Log entry, day 28. Today, the phone rang while I was holding the receiver to my ear. It was a surreal sensation, the sound of the ring vibrating through my own skull. The voice spoke clearly now, no longer waiting for me to react. It said, "Here." I saw it then. At the edge of the lantern's glow, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. It wasn't a monster, but a shape, a tall, slender silhouette with elongated fingers that seemed to reach out toward the phone line. Log entry, day 30. The final call came at dawn. The forest was silent. The air was still. The phone rang one last time, a long, sustained note that echoed off the wooden walls. I didn't wait for it to stop. I grabbed the receiver with both hands and shouted into the mouthpiece, "Who is this?" There was a beat of absolute silence. Then the voice came back. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was no longer a rasp or a whisper. It was my own voice, perfectly clear, but layered with 1,000 others behind it, like a choir of echoes. It said, "Me." As the word left the receiver, the shadow in the corner stepped forward into the light. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was a physical entity. It moved toward me, its long fingers reaching out to touch my shoulder. I didn't flinch. I felt its cold touch, a sensation of velvet and frost. It leaned in close, its face, if you could call it that, inches from mine. It wasn't a ghost from the woods. It was the accumulated memory of every person who had ever sat in this tower, listening to the silence. The shadow opened its mouth a wide, shimmering slit and exhaled a final breath of wood smoke and pine. Then it pulled me into its arms. The phone gave one final, tiny click, and then everything went still. I am no longer writing the log. I am part of the echo now. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.